Meteors swarm the site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure. Today, we're going to talk about scary stories in role-playing games on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who decided that the Merchant Consortium decided to send along a helpful android NPC to assist your party in the upcoming battle against some aberrations. I'm sure this is an absolutely trustworthy scenario. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Happy Halloween, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Storytelling in Pathfinder 2e. So in this series, we have been working through the tips and tricks and advice that Paizo offers to storytellers to help us tell better games at our tables, and we have been studying the fine art of storytelling in all its forms. And this video is going to be going up on October 31st, also known as Halloween. And I decided to do something a little special with today's video. I will admit that this video kind of just fell into place for me. I didn't originally plan for this, but we have been working through the different modes of play for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and we have covered most of the information that you need to know to successfully run Encounter mode in Pathfinder 2e, which means that it's about time to move on to Exploration mode. And I noticed that the first Exploration Mode video was going to fall on October 31st, on Halloween, and that kind of inspired me to do a video on telling scary stories. So in a way, this video is a logical continuation of the series that we've been doing, but it's also a little bit of a one-off video that is specifically discussing the subject of scary stories. Now, this series is designed for storytellers of every level, from beginner to veteran, and even if Pathfinder 2nd Edition isn't necessarily your preferred system, I invite you to be part of this conversation. One of the things that I have observed as a storyteller is that when we look at a variety of different games, we often pick up tools or ideas that we can bring back to our favorite game and help improve the stories that we are telling. Now, I do want to give a shout out in this video, and that is to one of my favorite content creators, and that is Seth Skorkowski. Now, he doesn't make Pathfinder 2nd Edition content. Most of his content centers around either Call of Cthulhu or the game Traveler, and you'll occasionally see a few other games thrown in as well. But he has a lot of background in telling scary stories, and my wife and I totally want to meet him at Gen Con some year and get him to run a Call of Cthulhu game for us. So Seth, if you're watching, please man. But I will say, if you would like to do a deep dive into tips and tricks and strategies for effective, suspenseful, horror-style games, that Seth is a fantastic content creator, and I really appreciate a lot of the things he produces. Here's a random video link to something he's done. Go check him out. With all that in mind, this video is not going to be drawing strictly from any of the content in the Pathfinder 2e core rulebook or the Game Mastery Guide that we normally use for this series. But instead, I'm just going to be talking about some of the principles I've learned for effective, scary stories at the gaming table. So let me fire up the evil laugh generator, and let's get started. Now, when it comes to scary stories, I feel like there are 4 general principles that are good to reflect on as a storyteller. And that is the concept of shock, the unknown, paranoia, and dangerous foes. And I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about these 4 different storytelling elements that you need to be aware of. But before I dive into those elements, I do want to offer a little bit of a precaution as a storyteller, and that is when we dive into the subject of scary stories, when we do horror-style games, it is important to recognize that we need to be mindful of our gaming group. I will be honest, there have been some occasions as a storyteller where I thought to myself, oh, this story beat would be a lot of fun, or oh, this will get a good reaction from my players, and it did get an intense reaction from my players, but after the game was over, I stopped and I realized that I may have crossed the line. Not intentionally, but I have unfortunately on a couple of occasions left my players feeling uncomfortable at the gaming table, and that is something I genuinely feel bad about. And I know it may be strange for a YouTube content creator who is very strictly family friendly in the way he creates his videos to say that I've crossed horror content lines with my players. While my definition of extreme may not match most people's definition of extreme, the thing is there are also people who might not have my definition of extreme. And one of the things that I have had to do to grow as a storyteller is to stop and be mindful of the fact that I have a responsibility to my players to make sure that the content that I am giving to my players is something that they're going to be comfortable with, is going to be something that they're going to find entertaining, and is not going to be something that's going to leave them uncomfortable at the gaming table. Scary Stories is one of the types of role-playing games that has the potential to unintentionally cross lines, and I just want to encourage storytellers out there, be mindful when you do these types of games. There have been a couple of instances where I have made a mistake and I have unintentionally gone too far, and I have had to apologize to my players for that, and so I want to encourage storytellers out there, be mindful, don't make the same mistakes I did. So let's dive into those 4 elements of scary stories and talk about how we can use them in our role-playing games. The first element is shock. And the element of shock is why I gave you that disclaimer a second ago. Shock is one of those elements in scary stories that is very easy to do wrong. Many of you have probably seen different scary movies in the movie theater, and you have probably seen a lot of instances of shock that is honestly not that entertaining. How many times have you heard someone complain about a horror movie that is nothing but a bunch of cheap jump scares? That is the element of shock used badly. And there have been plenty of movies that have tried to do something shocking that, rather than entertaining the people watching the movie, left the audience feeling cheated or even left the audience feeling hurt or angry by what the storyteller chose to do. Shock is probably an element of horror storytelling that is most frequently done wrong, and that means as storytellers, if we want to do something shocking in our game, we need to ask the question, how do we use shock, and how can it benefit our story? Shock can be done well. If you haven't figured out from several of the references I've been throwing out already in this video, my favorite scary movies are the Alien series. Alien, Aliens. I'm not that big a fan of Alien Resurrection, but I even like the Alien vs. Predator movies. Yeah, I know some of you out there are probably saying, the AVP movies have a terrible plot, and to that I respond, if you went to those movies for plot, you were in the theater for the wrong reason. But when we think about shocking moments in movie history, arguably one of the most famous shocking moments ever put to film is the original chestburster scene in the first Alien movie. That scene has been parodied and mimicked and mocked and sometimes outright copied in so many different ways, but that single moment made movie history in a lot of ways, and I imagine that there are a lot of horror fans who would hold that moment up as one of the best examples of shock done well in a horror movie ever. But let's ask the question, why is that scene effective? Is it because the characters are scared? Is it because the monster shows up? What is it about that scene that makes that scene leave such a lasting impression, not just on the people who watch the movie, but on the movie industry as a whole. Now, there's a lot you could dissect here, but I want to point out one particularly important element of this scene, and that is that this scene is, we'll call it, a game changer. This scene changes the pace, the purpose, the type of film that is taking place. You go from a mystery movie to a monster movie in a single scene, and you do so in a very dramatic and shocking fashion. This scene effectively changes the structure of the entire movie, and it does so perfectly. And that, I think, is the heart of using shock in our stories. Yes, a component of shock is the surprise that we give to our audience, and in terms of TTRPGs, the surprise that we give to our players. But more importantly than the surprise, that moment of shock needs to change the essence of the story in one fashion or another. Moving from the question of, what is this strange ship that we found, to where is the monster that is hunting us, that is a very dramatic shift. It's a huge tonal shift in the story, and a true moment of shock isn't just going to leave characters surprised, but it's going to make them realize that there is something fundamentally different happening in this story than whatever they initially thought was going on. That is the hardest thing to do if you want to do shock well. You want the story to make sense, you want your players to be surprised, but you also want to change the direction, style, or function of the story in some way. You want to change the perspective that your players have. This is tricky to do, and I could chase a lot of rabbits discussing all of the nuance to the idea of shock. A simple example, years ago one of my friends who was a game master set up a scenario where a party was hired to basically do a hit. They went on an assassination style mission. But there was a moment of shock where after the hit was over, they got dumped in the middle of the desert, and because they had gone on a hit, they had traveled very lightly, they didn't have any supplies. The game shifted from a Hitman Assassin's Creed style narrative to a survival against the wilderness style narrative, and that game master got his party and got them good. They were genuinely shocked to have been betrayed in that way, and it shifted the type of narrative of the story that they were experiencing. Doing shock well can be very, very effective, but you have to think not just how can I surprise my players, but how is it going to change the structure of the story that I am telling. Now, the next element that I want to discuss is the unknown. And that is the simple principle that the less your players or audience knows about the danger in front of them, the more terrifying that danger is. If knowledge is power, then lacking knowledge will leave a character feeling weak. And that's why one of the most important principles in scary movies is not showing the monster or not showing most of the monster for a significant length of the movie. That element of the unknown is part of the reason that those monsters stick with us. We want to know, we need that information, but we don't have that information. And so long as we don't have that information, it leaves giant gaps in our minds to fill in the blanks, if you will, ultimately making that monster seem far scarier than it might actually be. And again, let's talk about the Alien movies here. The Alien movies are a classic example of the cinema trope of not revealing the whole monster for a while. In those movies, you will often have a lot of off-screen kills or just very brief glimpses of the alien, of the xenomorph, and you don't get the full reveal of the creature until very late into the film. In fact, the only Alien movie that I don't really like is Alien Resurrection, and one of the big reasons I don't like Alien Resurrection is because they don't do a very good job of disguising the xenomorphs in that movie. The xenomorphs are either entirely off-screen or fully visible. There's none of the shadowy, sneaky, crazy camera stuff that you see in a lot of other Alien movies, and that's the reason that Alien Resurrection just never resonated with me. I know this is a tangent. I enjoyed the second Alien vs. Predator movie, because the predator and the alien stalking each other in the power plant was so visually beautiful that was just amazing to me. It's a wonderful example of showing how partially obscuring a monster or leaving things unknown can add to the impact of a story. What does this mean for us as game masters? Well, that means that when we're telling a story, one of the things we can do to heighten tension and make our stories scarier is to conceal the monster in some fashion. I'll throw a link up here to a video I did a while back about a little town called Whisper. In that particular story, the monster in that scenario wasn't actually hostile to the party. He was just hiding from the party until he had a chance to kind of evaluate them. But because my players didn't know what was happening, only that something was happening, the fear, the tension ratcheted up so quickly it was amazing. Not knowing what they were dealing with left my players terrified of a monster that was actually significantly below the party level. The unknown is a powerful tool if you want to tell scary stories. So let's move on to our third element, which is paranoia. There are plenty of scary movies out there that love to deal with the storytelling element of paranoia, questioning what you can trust. The idea that there is something else going on, the idea that there is another layer to the story, that another character may have ulterior motives of some kind. Paranoia can introduce a ton of tension very easily and very quickly, and can really help set the mood for the story that you're trying to tell. It is a very powerful tool in the Storyteller's toolkit. Yes, you can tell I'm fanboying about aliens in this film. In the first Alien movie, the android actually had ulterior motives that ran counter to what the main characters of that movie were trying to accomplish, and that android's ulterior motives ultimately resulted in some really bad stuff. And then, in the second movie, Ripley is afraid to trust another android because of the bad experiences she had with the first one. Paranoia is a story element that can pay off again and again and again in the narratives that you are creating. And it's usually not hard to introduce paranoia. Give a couple of NPCs ulterior motives, not even necessarily a hostile motive towards your party, just ulterior motives of some kind can introduce that sense of paranoia into a game and can really make your players start to question what's really going on, what's happening here, what should I really be looking out for. Functionally, paranoia happens when your players at least suspect that there is more to the story than is being presented to them in a particular moment. When they suspect that there is an additional unknown threat, when they suspect that their allies might not truly be their allies, when they suspect that there is something else going on, that is when paranoia leaks into the story, and that's when it begins to do some really incredible work in your games. But that raises the question, how can you, as a storyteller, effectively use and introduce paranoia into a game? And the best piece of advice, and honestly one of the first storytelling tricks that I ever learned, is let your players be right sometimes. Very early in my gaming career, I noticed that if my players were paranoid about something, and I let their paranoia be right occasionally, that it just fed so much more paranoia into my games. It ratcheted up tension and did it so quickly. This is like a shortcut to scary story tension for storytellers out there. If your players are paranoid about something, let them be right once or twice, and it will just become a confirmation bias for your players, and they will add the paranoia to your story for you. One of the classic examples from my group is I used to have a player who loved to think out loud, and they had a wonderful habit of saying, wait, what if there's a trap here? I would present something, I would send them somewhere, there would be something going on inside the game, and they would occasionally just stop and be like, I bet there's a trap in this room. And on at least 3 different occasions, magically there was a trap in that room. I hadn't originally planned for there to be a trap there, and the trap that ended up in those rooms on those occasions wasn't particularly dangerous, but the fact that their paranoid suspicion turned out to be true paid off in them being suspicious of so many other things in the story, and I didn't have to do it very often. Just doing it a few times helped feed paranoia into the story, and this really is one of those Game Master tricks that I have used time and again since then. If my players are being paranoid about something, not every time, but often enough to keep it going, I'll let them be right. So that's just some quick thoughts on how to use paranoia if you're trying to tell a scary story. Now, the last element of scary stories I want to talk about here is the concept of dangerous foes. And the premise here is that whatever it is that your players are dealing with in the story, it should be threatening enough that as a general rule they would seek to avoid an encounter rather than engaging in an encounter, and that they will only seek to fight the creature if they are either desperate or they have gained some kind of significant tactical advantage. Again, let's think about the Alien movies. A single xenomorph is incredibly dangerous in those movies, and even multiple people working as a group would most likely flee from one of the xenomorphs rather than try to fight the xenomorph unless they had significant military gear or some kind of major tactical advantage. Typically, they're going to try to avoid the fight rather than engage the fight because they know that the creature that they are facing is incredibly dangerous. It's really hard to have a scary story if your players are not afraid of whatever it is that they are facing, and that means one of the things you want to do is you want to communicate in a very clear way that whatever their foe is, it is dangerous. Now let's talk about this in Pathfinder 2e terminology really quick. If you're trying to run a scary story in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, you probably want to use severe or maybe even extreme encounters as part of that story. You want to create encounters that your players are going to seek to avoid unless they have a very clear advantage or they have been pushed to some form of desperation that would make them engage that encounter. Trivial encounters do not a scary story make. Now, in a previous video, we've talked about encounter mode play and the different levels of encounters, and one of the things we've talked about is when you're dealing with severe or possibly even extreme encounters, that you're often going to have breaks between those encounters. You often want to put space between events like that, or your players are very likely to die. But if you think about horror movies, if you think about scary stories, that makes sense. Your players will only engage the monster under very specific circumstances, and if they don't kill the monster, they're probably going to run, they're probably going to hide, they're probably going to regroup. They're going to take some time to try to gain another advantage before they go back after that particular foe. Telling a scary story in Pathfinder 2e means taking the time to clearly communicate that the foe that they are going after is dangerous and encouraging your players to think creatively, to work stealthily, and to try to manufacture some kind of advantage so that they have a chance of being successful against that particular encounter. But those are just some quick thoughts about elements of scary stories that you can use. Let me turn the conversation over to you. What elements of scary stories do you think Game Masters should consider when they're designing their games? Do you have any tips for the elements that we discussed in this video? Or are there other elements that you think Game Masters should also consider? Let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, like it and share it. Subscribe to the channel for more conversations about TTRPGs. Here in the near future, I'm hoping to do a special video on creating monsters and creating hazards in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And of course, we're going to be moving into a larger conversation on exploration mode in Pathfinder 2e. So stick around so you can be part of those conversations. Check out my Discord and my Patreon, links in the video description. Thank you so much for being here and being a part of the conversation, and have a wonderful day.